Dr. Mezuk is an epidemiologist. She is co-director of the Center for Social Epidemiology and Population Health in the Department of Epidemiology at the U of M School of Public Health. She is a social epidemiologist whose research focuses on understanding the interaction of mental and physical health. She is also a former policy debater and debate coach. Welcome, Dr. Mezuk.
Thanks for having me here.
I'm really, really excited. So for some context for this interview, I've been coaching debate now for about 5 years. And despite what I've seen with my own eyes, which is, some really extreme change in students, I have had lingering doubts about how to separate what I've seen about student growth versus, their personal growth as they age versus selection bias versus my effect in the classroom and not like debate's effect. And it wasn't until very recently that I started to look at the literature on debate. And so my hope is that this conversation can assuage some of my doubts about this activity. So your research, it really runs the gambit of public health, right? To name some of the factors you've studied, to name a very few of the factors, depression, suicide, loneliness, aging, diabetes, inflammation, drug use, community health. A recent paper analyzed the link between allergies and suicide. I feel like in the last couple of years, you've been extremely prolific, just huge amounts of papers. However, we are here to talk about a line of work that you derive, I believe, primarily from data from urban debate leagues around the country, at least 7 publications that I found, probably some more that I didn't find. To begin, could you just give us an overview of your work into debate?
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to always talk to folks about this. So I, as you mentioned, I'm a former debater. I debated for the University of Pittsburgh, as well as in high school. And then I coached debate with the Baltimore Urban Debate League while I was in graduate school at Johns Hopkins. And, I found this activity to be personally very fulfilling. When I was in fellowship, my first postdoctoral fellowship here at the University of Michigan over 10 years ago, I had wanted, this was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and there was a competitive grant process, but we were essentially told it was, we were very, very likely to get it. And we were strongly encouraged to try a very risky project, something that was not, that we were in love with, but, might not work sort of thing. And I went to the folks, the directors of my program, and I said, I want to study debate. And they're like, what are you doing? You're like, we're here to study health. And, and I was like, yeah, but it's, the tools aren't any different. When I analyze data, it's ones and zeros, and it doesn't matter if that 1 or a 0 is depression or the fact that you debated or your BMI or how many rounds you won. These are all, it's the same exact statistical tools that we use. And so I had reached out to the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues, and which I had not heard of before, kind of wanting to write this grant. And they had all these statistics all over their website about the impact of debate. And I, like you, went looking for those original papers to try to figure out, I'm like, okay, well, they say that debate, something's known about debate, yada, yada. And I couldn't find any of them. And I found, I wrote them, and they sent me what they had, which was essentially a conference proceeding at the National Communication Association meeting. And it was, they sent me the paper, and it was, let's just say, not rigorous. And, it never was published, as far as I could tell, beyond that presentation at a conference. And I know just different disciplines are different, but in my field, a presentation at a conference is that's not considered peer review, in the real scope of the thing, right? So what it meant is that there were essentially no quantitative peer-reviewed literature on debate in high school that we could, that was looking at educational outcomes. There have been these kind of communication folks who had been studying things like critical thinking, and there had been a lot of qualitative work about personal experience and things like that. But in terms of evidence for the claims that this organization was making, and that many people had also made, not just this organization, but that debate improves academic achievement. Essentially, there was almost nothing to support that. And it was through the conversations with them that, so I was planning on doing some work in Baltimore where I had connections, and they are based in Chicago. And they said, we have an archive of debate data from the Chicago Debate League for 10 years. Would you be interested in using this for your project? And so, it became a really fantastic partnership. We established, confidentiality rules, established independence, so they had data that they shared with me, which then I used to link other data to academic record, so it was a whole, and that, that's really how any kind of program evaluation like this works. Like it's very, if any, I actually can't even think of a real example where somebody has zero connection to the data and just is able to kind of do a completely,
right,
behind 5 different firewalls evaluation. But instead, you want partnership because you have questions about the data. Where did this come from? Why is this round missing? And we would talk to, even just, we had tab sheets. And so we had student initials, and, we were fortunate that a lot of those coaches were still there. So if we couldn't identify the student, because we had to link everybody back to administration records, we needed to know, like, all right, who is DT, and so, anyway, the point is that there were, that's sort of where things got started, and have continued. So we just recently published this paper with the Houston Debate League, which was our largest study in high school to date, and also the first study that we had done in a predominantly Latino district, which is, also, just very important given the growing proportion of American students who are Hispanic or Latino. And so, there's greater, we debate as a spoken, sort of experience needs to be inclusive of all students. And so there's a lot of emphasis on bilingual debate and things like that, which is really cool to see. So anyway, so that's sort of where we got started.
So you've worked now, I believe, with 3 different urban debate leagues. Is that right? Chicago, Baltimore, and Houston?
Yeah, so I personally never published data with Baltimore, but Dan Shackelford, who's someone I've collaborated with, did, and particularly focused on their middle school league. We're also working on a project now with Boston, but we haven't yet analyzed those, or we don't have data to share yet on that. I should say we're in the process, but so it's been, and most leagues are very willing and want to partner. The biggest hurdle is it's challenging logistically. It's challenging when there are competing priorities at the district level in terms of, resources to do certain projects. Different districts interpret FERPA, which is the law that protects student identified information, differently. I never see any identified information. No data ever comes to me that is with anything other than an anonymous ID.
But that all has to be prepped on the district side before.
Yes. Correct. Yeah. And so that prep on the district side requires time and energy, and it oftentimes it's really a matter of priorities. And I can't tell you how many times I've been on the phone with, an analyst or data manager from a district, and they're the only person, and they're also the IT person, and they're also, they have 6 or 7 different jobs. And so, there's often not infrastructure within districts to do this kind of work. And it's a shame because they really have the ability to really sort of quantify the impact of these massive investments, not just of debate, but of any kind of program that schools make, on whether they actually make a difference in terms of student outcomes.
Where do these data sets generally come from? Because it sounds like they're mostly from urban debate leagues. Is that because the urban debate leagues gather the data more rigorously, or why is it not from other private institutions or from the public system in general? Where is the data from?
So for me personally, like I'm not really interested in debate in general as it relates to education. So I would say for myself, it's because I'm interested in debate as sort of a means to address the the education gap that it develops early and widens as students go further. I would say there are districts that are very interested in I've been contacted, for example, by the National Forensics League and other folks who want to study this in other districts that aren't based in cities. And I always tell them, like, I'm happy to consult, or I'm happy to talk to the person, but I'm not going to lead that project. It's just not within my interest right now.
I see. I got it. You are a very, very busy woman, so I guess you have to prioritize things.
Yes, at some point you have to sort of say, that's, I mean, I've had people say, like, I want to know how debate relates to occupational outcomes. And, and again, like, I'm not saying that's not an interesting question, but it's not a question that I'm going to spend time answering.
Right. Before we talk about a couple of your studies, I think it's fair to say that you are either the or very close to the main researcher in this field. Is that accurate?
I would say, in terms of quantitative, kind of large scale using large scale administrative data to answer quantitatively the impact of debate, then yes, it's a very small group of people, but we all know each other and we all get along, which is nice. So I mentioned Dan Shackelford. I've collaborated with him. Beth Schuler at the University of Virginia is another person who's doing some of this work. And so, and there are many people I should also mention that I've met, just through this work, who've reached out, that are, either wanting to do work with different leagues or are former debaters and now want to do some work. And it really, the rate limiting step is really that actually getting the data and then knowing how to handle it. And those are skill sets that are in high demand, but also kind of hard to learn, for I shouldn't say hard to learn, but you're not just going to learn how to do large scale statistics in an afternoon.
No. So. and there's also of course the issue of gathering the data and right. Which is not just widely available for everyone to just use.
Correct. Yeah, you've got to have partners. You've got to have, I do a lot of work talking about what kind of institutional review board approval. I share all of this information with folks who, when they contact me, I'm like, this is how we present to the IRB. This is the kind of questions they tend to have. This is what security we have on our servers to protect people, everything like that. So for what it's worth, for example, in my day job, by which I mean, health research, most of the data sets I work on are, several thousand people, and for debate, that is the kind of, in order to get that kind of number for the work that we do at debate, it has to be administrative linkages, because the big question, or I should say the issue, the reason why this can't, it's a little roundabout way to answer your question, but sort of where the data comes from. So the leagues, they have information on their debaters, but they don't have any information on comparison students, which is really where they're like, it's almost not worth doing anything if you don't have a comparison, because something is almost always better than nothing. So, we need some way to account for self-selection we need a way to kind of understand how debaters are different than non-debaters. And in order to get that data on comparison students, that's where the linkages with the district's data, who can tell you these are students, or anonymously, right? These are anonymous students that are at the same school at the same year as your debater, right? So we can match on these characteristics. And that's, we always sample a much larger sample of comparison students to increase statistical power, that we can, if there is a difference, we can detect it. Because it's this balance of trying to really adequately represent what's happening. Mm-hmm. In the same way, our data on debate participation, and this is something that I think the leagues would like us to do a better job on. All of our data come from tab records, tournament participation records. And so if you went to even one debate tournament in our data, you're considered a debater. And there are folks who are like, well, I don't know if that's a fair threshold. Maybe they should have to have gone to 3 tournaments, and like, I can do all that. It's not
right.
But
right.
I think there's more selection, the more criteria, sort of pressures I put on the debaters that I actually can't impose on the non-debaters. Okay, so I don't have any way to sort of metric how intense a student you were, as for the comparison students, in a way that I do for the debaters. In an ideal
so the
world,
most useful separation is just debaters and non-debaters, even though there will be many variations within the debaters. There's not a lot to compare it to.
I have no way to metric the variation of the non-debaters. So in an ideal world, what I would like is, I would love for some other academically oriented after school co-curricular activity to call me up someday and say, we are in a district that has a debate league, and we want to share our data on participation. The league will share their data on participation, and then we'll have debater versus non-debater, debater versus whatever this other activity is. And you can do those two-way comparisons, which will sort of allow you to isolate the impact of debate versus doing some other academically oriented activity. Because then you can measure intensity of this other academically, or, what's chess club or something, like how many chess tournaments did you go to? Like, how good were you at chess, right? Like something else like that. I mean, it doesn't have to be that, right? But, so that's ideally but it's really hard to get that. And even when I've talked to districts about doing something like that, if we're not on their priority list, I don't want to say there's a disincentive, because that sort of sounds like it's intentional, but I think districts have very little incentive to determine if the programs that they support are as effective as they think they are. Because they're already, that's money that's left the bank, sort of, what I mean? It's already spent. And if it looks like it doesn't work, then is that money that leaves the district, or is that, is it either it works perfectly or we pay for nothing, so, and that may be true, like in the sense of like that may be their kind of political and economic reality. In my space, and in health research, there's much more nuance. Like oftentimes things work better for one group than another. Like that's kind of standard practice, I mean, people will say like, no, one size doesn't fit all. It's like, of course it doesn't. Like nobody believes that, but
and this goes, of course, doubly true for the private side of the industry where I work, where the companies tend to latch on to any small thing that tends to promote debate. And that like very blatant dishonesty sometimes is where my skepticism comes from. Because if you just told
I've seen my work misrepresented many times, actually.
If you just told me kids like debate, it tends to make them better readers or something. If you told me something general or it helps their academics, fine. But if you're telling me very specific things about the outcome that students are guaranteed in life based on debate, then I start to have obviously a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a couple of your studies, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
So there's a ton, and you may want to reference other things as well, because obviously you are much more familiar with your work than I am. But I want to touch on maybe a couple of the more shocking ones, let's say. So you have a 2012 study in the Journal of Adolescence finding that debaters were 3.1 times more likely to graduate from high school, and especially looking at at-risk students, that this finding holds across either low-risk or at-risk students. Can you talk about that and how you feel, I guess, just as a starting point, what is the mechanism for how an at-risk student can come into the debate program and then have their life change so much that they're more than 300% more likely to graduate from high school? That's a massive difference.
Well, so it's relative to the comparison student. So it doesn't mean obviously that like 300% of debaters graduate, right? It's relative. So to put this in context, so in urban lower resource districts, and we're only talking about public schools in Chicago district, for example, somewhere on the order of, 50 to 60% of kids will graduate high school. So that, and that's across all schools, across all levels of learning, et cetera. And so we're really measuring it against that. That's the comparison. Can we do better than 1 out of 2 kids? So now that the paper that you're referencing, one of the things we were able to do with that is because we had such rich data in Chicago, this is from a partnership. So there was a third partner here. So not only was it me at the University of Michigan and the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues, actually a fourth partner, Chicago Public Schools. The fourth partner was the University of Chicago and the Consortium on Chicago School Research, which had linked their Chicago public school data on things like neighborhood census tract, which we could then link to economic sort of characteristics of the area the student was living. We knew if the kid was free or reduced lunch. We knew if the kid qualified for special education or had I can't remember the development plan. So these sort of things. So we could really sort of metric kids who are really at very high risk of not completing, right? Because we know all of those things.
Because you're saying the average is 50, 60% graduation, but depending on your risk, that drops to 40, 30, 20, or
right,
whatever.
Exactly. Right. So and also, or it goes to 60, 70, 80%, right? And so like there's all this variation. And so to be able to then look within higher risk kids and within lower risk kids, and it was that lower risk kids certainly did much better. Like they were much more likely to graduate than higher risk kids, right? But we could have seen sort of, I guess, 3 things. Like the one thing we saw was that there really wasn't any significant, and by that I mean statistically significant. It doesn't mean there wasn't a point value difference, right? But that is, kids, if they debated and they were very high risk, they benefited. Kids, if they debated and they were very low risk, they benefited. The low risk kids didn't benefit quite as much. So, and part of this is because something's better than nothing, right? And so for the very high risk kids, if they didn't have access to other sort of things that were going to kind of keep them engaged in school, then this one thing can sort of suck up a lot of the variance. You know what I'm saying? Versus if the higher,
because you have just a lot more ground that you need to make up.
Exactly.
And once you already have, a lot of educational resources, a great kind of family structure and stable personal life, then there's much smaller differences you can make up from debate.
Right. Exactly. Right. And so, sorry, where was I going with this? So we could have found that debate was only helpful for the low risk kids, or was only helpful for the high risk kids, and instead we sort of found very similar. And so I guess for me, what's surprising about that finding is the fact that even low risk, that the even high risk kids seem to benefit, which again, we can explain, but we could have also imagined a world where actually there's all this selection, there's all this sort of other stuff going on, and debate can't,
right.
It's like there's no signal because there's so much noise happening, right? And so we could have seen it. I don't think that was a foregone conclusion that that's what we would have observed.
Right. So sort of the interesting thing about studying the intervention of debate in at-risk students, and I think urban debate leagues probably give you a lot of material for this, is that debate is classically seen and classically is kind of a elite activity, right? So presumably if you were to look at horse riding, you'd also find that horse riding seems to have great interventions for students, high school graduation, because they're all rich kids with a lot of resources, right? And so
it depends. If you had a comparison group though, that was, so it depends, right? So again, this is sort of the argument of, is it just something? And that something's better than nothing. But for that sort of, so if that is like, well, I'm riding horses, so I'm not, getting in trouble with drugs or other things that like cause kids to drop out of school, right? I mean, we know sort of often some of the factors that relate to school non-completion. So is it really just I'm taking up some hours of your time? It doesn't really matter what it is you're doing. You can be riding horses or playing lacrosse or playing the trombone or doing chess or doing debate. Or is there some other element of it that seems to be relevant? And I think for debate, the thing that, and maybe this is true of horse riding too, I don't know, is the competitive aspect to it. I think there is strong evidence now, I guess, qualitatively speaking, that this is something, and I say this in terms of even experiments that have been done completely irrelevant to or outside of debate, just sort of experiments where you think about like, how do we keep kids engaged in school? You know, and the economists do all these sorts of experiments. Well, do we pay for higher grades? Do we do, you know, what kind of incentives do we bring into the program or into this, you know, and students do respond to incentives. And like, we might not feel great about that. Like, well, we just want students to learn because it makes them better citizens of the world. But, you know, for me, it's just about what gets the job done, you know? So
yeah. I should maybe back up a little bit because we're obviously not going to have time to go over all of your work, but you have associated debate participation with increased attendance, decreased chronic absenteeism, academic performance in terms of grades with, once again, shocking results in terms of GPA, SAT scores, and a number of other things. So
I have... Yeah, let me clarify. So I didn't do the work on attendance or absenteeism. That's
okay.
Dan Shackelford's work in middle school. But I what I would say is he and I have both done, I guess, and maybe this is where you're going with this question, you know, this issue of self-selection is a huge one, right? Like, how do we account for differential self-selection? Because
could you briefly explain what that means? What
absolutely, yeah. So you know, when, and I'll come back to health. So when we do a randomized clinical trial, or even we're still living in COVID times, right? So these big randomized control trials that were done with the COVID vaccines, what happened was they had 40,000 people and they flipped a coin, and 20,000 of those people got the vaccine and 20,000 of those people got a shot full of saline solution. And then they followed those people over time, and it didn't take very long to figure out the people, and of course people didn't know what they've been assigned to, but the people who got the shot were less likely to get sick with COVID. Well, we don't have, and the reason we know that it's the shot that made that group different from the group that got the saline is because the randomization meant that there was no what we would refer to as sort of differential self-selection. It was just sort of, it was extraneously, exogenously assigned. It's the only thing that on average was different between the two groups. On average, they had similar number of men and women, similar age, et cetera. The reason I know it's similar is because that's how randomization works. Yes, there's like a little, you flip a coin 100 times, you're going to get approximately 50 heads and approximately 50 tails, okay? So that doesn't happen in 99% of what the things that we do in the world. And in fact, most of the medical interventions you or I or anyone has used aren't necessarily like, haven't necessarily been, gone through that in all ways. I shouldn't say most, some haven't. This is particularly true for
most are not, in other words, technically experiments.
Right. Yeah. So it's very hard to do. For example, it's very hard to do like experiments around surgical things, for example. Right.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point is, we don't randomize kids to debate. And so, nor do we randomize them to horse riding or chess or anything else. And so it means that kids choose to debate. And by definition, whenever somebody is going to like actively do something like this, there is a potential for differential self-selection. That is, there's a potential for higher performing kids who were going to do well anyway. They happen to, walk by the sign that then the debate says debate, and they're like, they stop there, and they could have just, if they had just, turned left instead of right and walked into art class, then that would have been what they did. And debate had no difference, right? It's really just these kids were going to do something. So the way that we account for that, so it's very important to account for differential self-selection because it allows you to, and I will say, like, I think, there may be places in the papers where it's a little less hedging, but I'm try very hard to hedge the statements that we make, that we are accounting for differential self-selection based on observables, that is, things that we know about the students. But there are a lot of things we don't know about the students. I don't know if they're from a single parent or two parent home, for example. I don't know how many books they have at home, which is something that's been correlated, for example, very highly with child outcomes. So what I do know about these kids, which makes our data fairly unique, particularly in terms of educational program evaluation, is that I know how well they were doing on standardized tests and class grades before they had the opportunity to debate. So in Chicago, we have at the time that we were doing our study, they did not have a middle school debate program, and we had test scores, standardized test scores that all students in Illinois take on students from 8th grade. And so we know that the kids who decided eventually, when they got into high school, the kids who did debate did do better on those standardized test scores in 8th grade. They did not do well, though. So on average, debaters do better than non-debaters, but they are not in the 99th percentile of performance by any means. And in fact, you can look at there's substantial overlap in the two distributions. The debater curve is shipped a little bit to the higher scores, but almost all of that is actually overlapping, which is great news for us, because when we use our statistical approaches, which is this idea of propensity scores, which is the first thing I do is predict the probability that you debated. And then I use that probability as a weight to account for differential self-selection into the activity. So it's a two-stage process.
Okay.
But that weight only makes any sense if there's actual overlap in terms of these two distributions. And sometimes, not in our data, but like there are lots of examples where that wouldn't necessarily be the case. I'm trying to think of, like, if you wanted to know, like, use this approach to say, does smoking cause diabetes or something like that, right? Well, smokers in the United States are very, 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 very different from non-smokers in the United States, right? From lots of different characteristics. In fact, there may be some characteristics on which there's almost no overlap, and so that would be a hard thing to show using the technique that we use, for example. So, but sorry, it's my dog, BB. But most research, and certainly none of the research prior to the work that we did in Chicago, but most research in this kind of educational program evaluation has the ability to account for that kind of rigor in self-selection, like because even if they have information on pre-participation achievement, it's often collected retrospectively. And so by that I mean, I asked the debater, hey, debater, how'd you do? You're in 10th grade now, but how were you doing in middle school? And like of course, they're going to not remember quite right, or they might overestimate or da. So here it's like, no, this is an objective measure of your performance on the state test. I know you took it before you could have even walked into a debate round, so I don't have any question about which came first. And we use that along with things like special education, free reduced lunch, trying to think of all of these other sort of characteristics, a whole set of characteristics to account for self-selection. And the downside of our modeling approach is that if you use that, whatever you kind of put into the propensity score, the things I use to predict debate, means that I can't really examine variation as a function of those characteristics. So that 2012 paper you were mentioning earlier, where we looked at high risk versus low risk students, that did not use propensity score methods, which is probably why that assessment was a little bit higher than what we see in our other papers. Specifically because if we use risk status in the propensity scores, then I can't examine it later on. So it's almost I see. If you matched on, if you had a sample of like just women, for example, then you couldn't look at sex differences, for example.
Right. That makes sense. I have a couple general questions for you, but one more paper I'm curious about. Once again, we could talk for, I'm sure you could talk for many days about all of these papers, but it's a 2019 paper published in Educational Research and Reviews looking at grit. So debate participation may change some non-cognitive skills, essentially making students more gritty. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, so this was, so this is a small study. So this is a couple sort of caveats first. So this is a survey we did of debaters, current Chicago Debate League students. And we did it twice in the fall and in the spring. And we were interested in essentially trying to identify mechanisms. So you said at the, sort of the beginning, like, is it debate? Is it my teaching? Is it, whatever. So, in terms of what helps students stay engaged in school or do well in school, they're both psychologists and educational researchers and even economists are doing a lot of work on this idea of non-cognitive skills, which are things like perseverance, sort of self-belief, self-efficacy, things like this. And they then get renamed grit and growth and, these other sort of, but we're really just talking about what happens when you don't do well. Do you keep going? What happened? Do you believe that you can overcome things, etc.
Is this related to personality?
So yeah, so there's a whole world of like psychologists who've been studying this for a long time, right? In terms of, then they have different terms for it. It's been in terms of the education space. So that's why I'm kind of mean, like, it's really, I was talking to a group, a couple, I guess this was last year now, about the idea of hope and like hopefulness. And like, maybe that's what debate is. And they kind of had this, and I was like, well, and really, it's really about kind of an optimistic view towards the future. And optimism is certainly considered a trait of personality. So, anyway, so what we were interested in was to try to, for the first time, as far as we could tell, provide some sort of, quantitative data on these constructs for debaters. We had a much more ambitious plan than what we were able to pull off. So I would express the findings as predominantly exploratory and hypothesis generating. But I think the reason why I think debate might be related to changes in grit is specifically because of this competitive nature of it, that you get feedback quite quickly on your performance. We also in that paper talk a lot about cooperative learning and sort of that's a different type of learning than what students get in the vast majority of their classroom. I don't know about you, but like I hate group projects. And part of the reason why I hate
students do.
Yeah, most students do, right? Well, debate is a group project, except it's a group of two, nested within this larger group. And it's a different type of cooperative learning. And I think there is that when I think about like what makes debate different from horse riding or some other activity, it's that there's that competitive aspect, but also this sort of cooperative, you're going to have to get along with somebody. And so, to me, I would say that I think a real opportunity for future research on debate, and this is not specific to urban debate settings or urban school settings, but could be done anywhere, is really when students are challenged, and by that I mean lose debates, or don't do well. How do they come back, and what are the types of strategies that are helpful for that? Because to me, then that gets has the potential to get translated into you didn't do well on a test, or these other sorts of things that can lead to a sense of frustration and disengagement. So we've never published on this, but I'd be more than happy to talk to anybody about it. So in addition to the standard measures of grit and growth that we included in that study that you mentioned, we also, and by we, I mean the staff with the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues, we wrote vignettes about that placed those within debate rounds. So we said, okay, so now imagine that it's a debate tournament and your partner doesn't show up, or it was like you lost every round, and then asked her, what are the things that you would do? And so trying to kind of help them think about this specific, because the way that these are asked is, very academic. So you're talking to like a 16-year-old and you're like, you believe in yourself, and it's just like, some of them are just, they're not going to, but it's like, oh, well, I'm in this debate round and like, how, would you be angry with your coach? Would you say you're going to quit debate? Like try to kind of actually apply it within this vignette setting. And then we asked a similar one about school settings in general. So, you studied for a test, but you didn't do well, so just to kind of, we've never published on it. But it's again, I think it's hypothesis generating and could be fruitful for future work.
Interesting. So I did want to ask you about this, about essentially future directions for your research or for research in general, or even for hypothetical research, because I understand that debate is a passion of yours. And I think if you had only studied debate, you would have a very impressive career in only studying debate, but it doesn't seem like it's your main area of study, because you do many other things. So, imagining, let's say, like an alternate universe where you're working exclusively as a debate researcher, what directions would you want to go in, or what might be possible in the future? And also curious about, since you started this work in 2009, or even when data started to be collected in 2005 or before, what has changed in gathering data, or what would you like to see change in gathering data that could help this future research?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first. So I think districts and programs in particular are much more aware of the value of information that they have, in whether it's in terms of any internal evaluation they might want to do, or the potential for someday down the road. I mean, I keep a lot of things and like, someday I'll need that. Well, you might need that, so because you can't recreate these sort of things. And now that tab rooms are mostly done electronically, it provides a whole new wealth of things. All of our tab, I mean, I had a research assistant entering every one of those tab records by hand, because they were like a printed out tab record. So that makes it easier. I think that more and more districts are, it's interesting. We presented this, we actually got a symposium into the American Education Research Association meeting, which is the large sort of meeting of education researchers in the United States. And I presented with Steve Stein from the Boston Urban Debate League. He was their executive director at the time. Susanna Anderson, who's now at Temple, who at the time was at Tulane, and who's the first author of the paper you mentioned earlier, and the executive director from the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues. And we had practiced, we had all this work, I was like, this is it, like, we're going to get debate into education, because we're this little niche thing, and it's just debaters who know about us, and like people who study education or programs, like this is it.
Yeah.
And there was no one there. There was actually, that's not true. There was one person in the room. And I mean, this is like a large room. And we were literally like looking at each other, like, should we even do it? And I'm like, well, this guy's here. We got to do it, right? There's one guy.
Was this an 8 a.m. presentation?
I wish. It was not. It was the last day of the conference, but it wasn't 8 a.m. And so after we presented, we did our shtick. I mean, it was heartbreaking, to be honest with you. I mean, we had done all this work, paid to come to Philadelphia, And I asked him, I said, can you sort of tell us, like, what made you come to our session? And he literally said, I thought this was actually a different session, but then I realized I was the only one here and I didn't want to leave you. And I was like, oh my God, no one cares about debate. So I guess, and maybe that comes down to like why somebody like me, who's got in a degree, or, my degree's in public health, I'm in a school of public health, why I'm the one doing this work, because, there's the education folks, this is not on the radar. The communications people who where debate is on the radar are not, this kind of quantitative large scale data analysis is not really part of their training or within their kind of lens of what they're focused on, I should say, in terms of, they're more interested in well, I don't know, just sort of the nature of argumentation and rhetoric, et cetera, like not, does it make any difference in terms of educational outcomes? But that was very disheartening to sort of see. And I would love, so to answer your question about what I think of the future, I think I would love to actually have partnerships with educators, with people in schools of ed, and like Dan Shackelford, that's his degree, is in education policy. He's now going to law school. So he'll, I'm hoping though that he and people like Beth Schuler, I hope that they're the future. Beth is an education policy researcher. And so, to me, that's.
Sorry, can you tell me her name one more time?
Oh, Schuler, Schuler. She's at the University of Virginia. So I hope that they are the future, this kind of work, because it's not just program evaluation, which I understand why that's not like a sexy thing and people don't really want to do that. But to me, like there is the potential here to have a totally different conversation about how students learn and how to, just this isn't a new math or a new whatever, right? Which, may well be helpful in these different things, but this is, and I say this as a coach, right, too. So the very first time I coached debate, I walked into a room and I was prepared, and I walked in, I was writing on the board and stuff. And within 10 minutes, I'd lost, I'd never talked to high school students before, and I'd lost them. And I was fortunate. I had Rob Hughes was my co-coach. He had been a teacher at Forest Park High School, which is where my first place I coached, been a teacher there for many years. And I'm so thankful and grateful for his mentorship. So the first day, it doesn't really go well. And he, kind of come out to her afterwards. And he's like, next time just try this, and kind of don't give up, kind of, because, I'm like, pay attention. Why aren't you paying attention? I'm right up here. Someone's up at the front of the room. The next time it did a little bit better, but still not what I wanted. And he suggested some things, Anyway, by the third or fourth time, I finally got it. And I would just put the resolution on the board and then just go sit in the back. And I would say, all right, we're going to need, someone to, appoint a person to run each side, and they would do that, and they would immediately volunteer. I'm like, all right, now, and it is a debate is student directed 100% of the time. I mean, the coach, the judge should not be talking at all, except to tell you how much time you got left and to tell you why you won or why you lost. And when you think about the amount of time that young people spend in a room where they are the one listening to an adult versus they are the one speaking to an adult, it is exactly inverse. Debate is exactly inverse of almost every other opportunity young people have to talk to adults. And to me, that is transformative. Like that is, and I didn't understand that at the time when I was debater. I just knew I liked to argue and I hated to lose. So those were the two things that in my mind were motivating me. But the idea that there was an adult in the back of the room that was hanging on every word that I said, even if it was nonsensical, that they were paying attention, that is transformative. And I can't think of a single other opportunity that students have to have that dynamic inverted like it is in debate. And I say this also in terms of any types of debate. I think that's the other sort of thing, like the debate folks, and by that I mean, lots of people, like, well, is it policy? Is it Lincoln Douglas, whatever, and like, again, this is something that's not very interesting to me, to personally, right? It may well be interesting to people who study this, but who have like skin in whatever game.
Right.
But one of those things they all have in common is that they all have this inverted relationship of speaker to listener in terms of, adolescent to adult. So
that is enlightening.
I'll try.
Yeah.
So that's what I hope the future of this. I hope, I don't think we need another study showing debate has X, Y, or Z impact on education outcomes. I mean, I really think that we have to bridge this gap between what debate is and why school. I don't know what else, just like real basic questions. And I think that this pandemic has given us an opportunity to really question why we do a lot of things the way that we do them. And, it really has shown that there are some things where it's just like, that's just the way we've always done them. Or there was some, it's money, or it's, there's like those, and those are things that are modifiable versus, oh, well, this is obviously the best way. And this way is the preferred way, you know what I mean? So I hope that, and the fact that debate survived the pandemic, it's amazing that people did virtual debates, and like, will this be able to continue happening and things like that? I mean, that's pretty incredible. So it comes a long way from carrying tubs that weigh 50 pounds, which is the kind of debate that I grew up on. So
yeah. So I love that. So you feel like, as far as useful information that you can mine from extant data sets, like this has been done, we see debate works, we see it works across many metrics as an intervention, and you're curious about bigger questions about
personally, yeah. I mean, I think they're, and bigger questions, and figuring out how to get people who make decisions about education interested in debate. And I think that is both a empirical question and a sort of philosophical one. And so I think that, to me, those are the two big areas. I think that if students want to do, or if not just students, if people want to do projects, and they've got the time and resources and interest, I mean, I think it's very helpful for leagues, I should say. So I don't want to say, don't waste your time on it, but it is helpful for leagues when an outside evaluator can, come in and even just talk to them about what kind of data do you need if you ever wanted to do something like this in the future. But in terms of, what do I think is the big unanswered question? It's those sorts of things.
Well, Bree, it's been great talking to you. Thank you on behalf of the entire community for, not just talking to me, but for putting so much time and effort and years into answering these questions that perhaps very few other people are.
Well, it is a labor of love, I will say. It's the most rewarding work I've ever done, to be honest with you. It's, I know how important I think, at least, debate was to my life. And I don't think debate necessarily had an impact on my grades or likelihood of graduating at all. But I can tell you, I use what I learned in debate every single day as a scientist. I don't read without a pen in my hand. And I learned that to take notes and to, I still bracket just like I did when I used to cut cards. And I learned that in debate. And whenever I have to give a presentation, that's just muscle memory now, in terms of how do I engage the audience? Why should they be listening to me? How do I break this up? How do I make my point? And it's a tremendous, the more people who can do it, I think the better, even outside of, any educational outcomes. But again, as I said at the top, my personal interest, and the reason why I've only done work on debate in urban districts is really because I think that it does have potential to really address the achievement gap that is, I don't know what plan even A is as far as national policy in terms of addressing that. It seems to be more of the same, which is empirically demonstrated to fail. So I am looking forward to trying to sort of make the case, beyond this. But no, and it's been a labor of love and a pleasure. And I'm so thankful that people have sort of responded to the work in the way they did, because as I mentioned at this conference, there have been times when I'm just literally talking to an empty room. And even in my own world in public health, I don't think anybody really knows the work I do on debate, in my day-to-day life. I put it in my bio specifically in the hopes that another former debater will show up in my class one day And I always actually ask in my class, are there any debaters in here? And like they don't want to major in public health for some reason anyway, but it's just, but if you are a debater and you're thinking about graduate school, I encourage you, come get a degree in public health. So we need you. We need people who are smart and who can think on their feet and who can be persuasive, as our pandemic has demonstrated. So, all right.
One final question, because this is I'm curious about this for the researchers who do study debate, and for your I assume you have a number of students who work on this as well. I could be wrong, but are they mostly former debaters? Is that what sparked their
Almost
interest?
not. Yeah. I mean, my very first doctoral student was a former debater, but ever since then, at least not that they've disclosed to me, they're debaters. And it's interesting. I will say, I would love one of the things then I'll be done. So this small project I mentioned that we did in Chicago with the survey of grit and growth. So in addition to that, we had this kind of wild idea that we weren't actually able to implement, but maybe somebody can do it someday. So I will put it out there into the world and somebody can pick this up and run with it. We wanted to videotape students in the fall, like one of their first debates, and then videotape them again at the end of the year. So kind of like a rebuttal redo, except they don't actually have to watch it and do it themselves, but then have debaters. So I'd actually already contacted the director of debate at Michigan to say, I need you to find some debate, because we talk quickly. So you need somebody who actually knows, who can listen and has an ear for it,
right.
to watch it and to then analyze. We were going to literally like analyze the flow across these two. That was the plan. And so as part of our consent process, we would ask students if we could videotape them. And the plan was, okay, well, when we get 4 students that, were both members of one team and both members of the other team have consented to this, then we will videotape the round. And we never got that pair to hit. So in a debate tournament, so we actually couldn't implement it. But I think that that kind of change would be, and again, I think that that's very niche, and kind of boutique type of stuff. Sorry, just, but in terms of like, I think there is this is why this is relevant. I'm like, why are we talking about this? I think there is actually a really important role for people who have done this activity to pose new questions, either from their own experience or propose different ideas of how to look at the data. I know there's like an active group on Facebook that does work on like college debate. Again, this is not my personal interest, right? But there are people who are kind of trying to work on this. And so I think there's, the fact that there's sort of this energy, I hope, around the question, I think is the best thing, because you really want as many independent groups working on it as possible. And for example, like that's why Dan Shackelford's work in middle school was so important, because it was just completely independent in a completely different setting, and used a more rigorous method even than our work, frankly, because he was looking at it time varying covariates and things like that, which we hadn't done in our initial work. So the more replications you can have, the better. I don't think you're going to learn if debate has an impact on education anymore. I think we know the answer to that. You're going to learn sort of under what conditions, or these other sorts of things, like who seems to benefit most, who's left out, and maybe that could inform different things. But
great, super good answer. Once again, thank you so much, Bri.
Of course. Thanks so much.
All
right.
Yeah,
bye.
All right, bye.